Test. Are you guys able to hear me? Yes, I'll be watching the game and doing a live stream. So if I get choppy and confused, it's y'all's fault. Let's give a few more people time to hop on. Is there any kind of lag or any kind of sounds okay? All right, go Treem. You say you have the first question. Go. You guys need to thank Harrison for reminding me that I was going to do this live stream because I was this close getting ready to go to bed. I think it's a good point. Tareem, I think looking at this, I kept focusing in all the other classes about um, just focusing on the Little Rock Nine and the Freedom Riders, but I think it is, without a doubt, important to understand Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board in the grand scheme of state governments versus, federal governments. I'm kind of embarrassed that I didn't specifically address that in class. And I was just so focused on trying not to overwhelm you with so much information, but I think it would be very important. The four that you've got highlighted in that question on the chat, I don't see anything. I mean, you knocked those four out of the park. I think that's plenty. I think I'm just, all right, Gracie's question regarding Birmingham, did Kennedy send in federal troops or did I make that up? I think in Little Rock 9 case was, the federal troops were sent in once they got out of Montgomery heading towards the Mississippi line. If you can remember from the documentary, there were troops waiting on the Freedom Riders to escort them, protect them when they got into Mississippi. So there were federal troops that were in Mississippi, but not necessarily Birmingham. Hold on, are you talking about, Gracie, are you talking about the Birmingham campaign? Or are you talking about the Freedom Rides? Because if you're talking about the Birmingham campaign in '63, federal troops were not sent in there. You sure you got me, Gracie? Because now I don't know if I've got lag in this video or whatever, but I want to make sure that the question you're talking about, are you talking about, when you say Birmingham, are you talking about the Birmingham campaign with Dr. King? Are you referring to the Freedom Rides? That was the Birmingham. It was a mixture of federal government mediation and local political individuals in and around Birmingham working together to get the individuals like Bull Connor and the old guard out. I know it's a terrible answer, but that's the gist of it. Let me see if I can find you a better answer, better worded answer. Give me a second. I'm looking at a website here. April 10th, 1963, Birmingham officials received an injunction to stop the protesters. King and Shuttlesworth and the SCLC all decided to disobey the injunction. Let's see, in the aftermath, downtown Birmingham was brought to a standstill after what became the Children's March. Let's see. Kennedy did convince the African American community and King to negotiate with city leaders to bring an end to the protest. May 10th, the following terms were announced. Segregation of public water fountains and bathrooms in Birmingham ended. Lunch counters in downtown Birmingham were integrated. Programs would be enacted to examine African American employment practices. So the gist of how it was resolved was from political leaders and King working together to end certain segregation practices in and around Birmingham. Gracie, I hope that answers your question. I know it was very weak, but in the grand scheme of the Birmingham campaign, a lot happened, but it's not necessarily as a lot what happened, like say in the scope of the federal government. All right, Morgan's asking a question. Do we need to know a ton of details about the NAACP? You just need to know how the NAACP influenced civil rights events. You don't necessarily have to know who founded the NAACP. You know, what were its goals? Like the NAACP provided the lawyers necessary to litigate during the Brown versus Board of Education, the case. Other civil rights cases, that organization would have provided legal defense, would have provided the funding for the legal defenses in all major civil rights cases. So just think of it as the major civil rights organization that does exactly what it was asked to do, or what it says it was in its name. It was there for the advancement of colored individuals. Rustin's next question. So in terms of the national narrative and moving the civil rights movement forward, what main takeaways do we need to understand about sit-ins in Greensboro and Nashville? All right, so the main takeaway, Rustin, is the effectiveness of the protest, how the protest was used, how individuals were prepared for the protest, what they had to do during the protest, how their actions and to make the protest successful. And then in areas like Greensboro, Nashville, Birmingham, Alabama, and even in Chattanooga, there's stories of African American students sitting in to segregated lunch counters to simply push the conversation forward that segregation was immoral and just a hindrance, detriment to the moral well-being of African Americans. Let's see. You want to be able to obviously understand SNCC's involvement and why college kids were doing it. You would need to know how it affected the businesses and forced business owners to change their practices, because if they don't, ultimately they're going to lose profit. I focused all 4 periods today on highlighting the different groups and their protest. I know I keep saying this, that I don't want my confidence or my ego to get in the way, but I've talked about these groups multiple times and tied them to different civil rights campaigns, and I feel like everybody, top to bottom, and I sincerely mean that, is capable of looking at these groups and talking about what they did in the civil rights campaign, the different types of specific events, and then you being able to analyze on your own or evaluate the successes of those protests. And that main idea, civil disobedience leading to nonviolent protests that had to be met with violence for change to occur. um, it would impress me that if you understood John Lewis's role in SNCC. Um, Diane Nash was the female that was involved in Nashville. That was a member of Fisk University that led the Nashville campaigns. She's the one that went toe to toe with the mayor in Nashville and asked him, specific how he felt about specific things going on. SNCC's later involvement, you'd connect to Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement. Those are big facts, but I think you still could be capable of writing a very good essay without name dropping. Morgan, remember there's 6 questions, so if I give that state-federal disagreements, I'll probably, just so y'all don't get upset or the class doesn't get upset, I'll probably randomly assign numbers to the questions and then, randomly get y'all to choose, and that way it's not skewed and you can't say, hey, I'm giving one question to one group and one question to the next. No, there's only one question but then again, Morgan, a lot of the incidences were conflicts between state governments and federal governments or local governments, so. By the way, this game tonight might be one of the most boring games you'll see all year. Tareem, will there be 2 questions pertaining to state and federal governments because I've been prepping that all night? Tareem, what if you prep that all night and then that question doesn't even show up tomorrow? Honestly, Tareem, like if you're focused on that, I feel like that information can answer multiple questions. Like I feel like you're gonna be equipped to answer a question. Like I know that doesn't make sense. Like just because it's not worded specifically about state and local governments, I still feel like knowing that information, you're going to be able to analyze or evaluate the effectiveness of certain things. So if you go back and you look at your 4 main things that you looked at with Plessy, Brown, Little Rock 9, and Freedom Rides, like I feel like if you knew that information top to bottom, you're going to be able to answer. You're going to be able to answer. Like you're going to be able to come at it from different perspectives to answer the question. Yeah. Give me a second, Morgan. I mean, I do think the Emmett Till story it's one that I always get passionate about when we're studying this material. I'm actually looking at the test right now. Give me a second, I gotta change over to a different Google account. My computer is very slow. Morgan, I see at least two questions on the test that's Emmett Till's story would be, you know, examples that would fit right into the narrative of you answering the question. Um, looking at what Tareem put down, yeah, I mean that, you know, even if you're addressing the effectiveness of groups, civil rights groups, you could talk about how the media or how even Mamie Till wasn't necessarily part of a civil rights group, that she was able to use the media in a way to influence the civil rights movement forward, or at least bring the light to the types of violences that type of violence that was going on in Mississippi. Harrison, I think all four periods struggled with being confident about the black Muslim, Black Panther, Malcolm X type situation. And I think the issue is that most most of you guys know so much about the nonviolent protest because there's just simply more information and more proof that it was effective. At the end of the day, there were few things that were associated with the Black Panther Party and the Black Muslim Nation of Islam type movement that was positive. It was marred by violence, corruption within the leadership of the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam. I mean, it was the Nation of Islam that was responsible for assassinating Malcolm X. It was mass hysteria um, caused by the Nation of Islam, given this idea of, the Black Muslims given this idea that the white individual was the devil. They were responsible for the corruption and the oppression of African Americans, that the black race was the superior race. So it was a very difficult thing for, especially white individuals that were supporting the civil rights movement to start hearing, um, because it created a divide. So if you go and you start looking at why the Black Panthers, Malcolm X, those ideas come up, I think if you created an essay in comparison and contrast between Dr. King and Malcolm X, 2/3 of your essay would be centered around the nonviolent protest, the civil disobedience type ideas of King, and maybe a third of it's discussing the violent, radical opposite surrounded by Malcolm X. You don't need to know. Morgan, knowing the dates helps me um, verbalize it helps me organize my thoughts. I, I don't I don't necessarily, like when I'm going and I'm grading this, I'm looking for the bigger ideas. I'm not looking for dates. Like if you put down that the Freedom Rides were in 63, and they went down in 61, like to me that's not going to be a huge deterrent, like for me reading the essay, as long as you're staying, the course of explaining or analyzing the question. But knowing the dates does, like I said, help you organize your thoughts and place a timeline. Like I know, that a result of Plessy was Brown, and Brown's, decision after Brown led, the next big outcry in 55 was Till, and 55, 56 was Rosa Parks, and Rosa Parks's experience in the Montgomery bus boycott was influenced by Emmett Till. It's like all these stories and these dates build off each other. So, you know, I think it helps. Yeah, Aliza, that's all I'm gonna say. Can there be a question? There will be a question. Like, I have no problem telling you that because that's pretty much how it's worded. Or it's not exactly how it's worded. See, like, all right, I'll go ahead. I mean, Aliza has brought to light a question that you would, you know, violent groups like the Black Panthers, Nation of Islam, Black Muslims were centered around being violent, separating themselves from the white race, declaring that the black race is superior, black is beautiful, black power. Um, and it was, like I said, an exact opposite or stark contrast of what King was trying to accomplish. And if you start looking at all the civil rights organizations like SNCC and the SCLC that were based off of nonviolent protest, um, gospel preaching, um, it's an exact opposite idea. And so, the ideas of, the nonviolent protests, like if you look at the sit-ins, if you look at the freedom rides, if you look at um, marches and things like that, did they end up creating more change than, arming black individuals and preparing them for violence, in a very hostile world? I do think the peaceful protest worked better. I don't have any evidence of violence. Like none of the civil rights legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of '64 or the 24th Amendment, can be like none of the violence that was portrayed by these radical activist groups could be accredited in helping change the narrative for the good. It, I, yeah, Rustin, I do think that that's where you would argue the effectiveness of these radical groups is. I think, Rustin, we addressed this in third period. Like if you start looking at SNCC after Stokely Carmichael's leadership, a lot of universities started to offer African American studies to educate uh, people about um, African American culture. There was a sense with the Black Panthers about providing for uh, individuals that were in poverty. And so I do think, Rustin, that addressing um, community building, education, different ideas like that would be a way to argue or to analyze the effectiveness of the radical movement. You can even go back, and I don't think I did this in third period, but I did it in either sixth or fifth. There's an example in your textbook about after, let's see, I can't remember the date on it, but James Meredith, the individual who was responsible for integrating the University of Ole Miss, marched from Memphis to somewhere. My mind's going blank. It's cloudy, but it was simply called the March Against Fear. You can look at it in the textbook. It's in the under the section of Black nationalism and discussing the Black Panthers. But in that march, there was solidarity between that movement and Dr. King. But I think then, like, Meredith was shot, and there just ended up being more violence, in it. Memphis to Jackson, that's right. I think that's a good point, Rustin. I do think that um, addressing the education and the community building is an effective, a positive influence. Just when I'm analyzing it, I just automatically go to what happened within the federal government, but that's not necessarily the most important. While you're thinking of other questions, I'm just going to go off on a rant here and just talk out loud for a second because I don't think I ever get an opportunity to do this. And I try to go up to uh, different ones of y'all during the day and individually and, um, try to say positive things. And I think there's a lot of the relationship that I've built that, sometimes I say, silly things and things that maybe can be construed maybe as disrespectful or kidding around with you guys, but I cannot be more proud and simply um, honored uh, to be y'all's teacher. I think this has been one of the most competitive, um, one of the most in-depth, um, challenging, uh, wonderful years of my teaching career. I'm almost 15 years into the teaching profession. This is my fourth year at Signal, and I don't know if I'll ever be around as much smart people on a daily basis that I am every day I walk into my classroom. And I hope you can hear the sincerity in my voice when I say that, top to bottom, from the kid that's got the 28 to the kid that's got 108. Some of the most magnificent people I've ever been around. There's only one question, Treem, that I feel like deals with the black nationalism side of thing. I think you're going to be okay with what you got. There's not. I'm not going to give you the question, but I think you'll be okay. I have a double chin on this live feed. Need to lose some weight. Ask me some more questions. I'm getting delirious. See, I hope you all find a profession as easy as mine. I've told y'all plenty of times, I don't ever remember being around a curriculum that puts this much stress on kids. But I don't think y'all see the benefit in it yet. I think you'll see it in 3, 4, 5 years when you're in college and you're kicking tail and you're in your junior year and you're thinking, God, my junior year in college is much easier than my junior year in high school. Be interesting to have a live stream in about 15 years and see where all of y'all are at. Yeah, so which one you want me to do first, Ethan? Freedom Ride or Freedom Summer? Both to me are important. Um, I, which one you want me to do first, Ethan? Let's just go in order because Freedom Rides would have happened first before the Freedom Summer. Um, Freedom Rides are gonna be associated with CORE. All right, you've got to associate um, the Freedom Rides with James Farmer and the Congress of Racial Equality because that would have been the group that was going to test out the court's decision on whether or not public transportation and accommodations were segregated or desegregated with the Boynton versus Virginia case. All right, and so the goal was to just get on a bus and drive through the heart of the deep South, the segregated South, the hill, and see what was going to happen. It was to test these ideas and to see if they're. I mean, you can't even call it civil disobedience because they were not technically breaking a law by getting on the bus and riding down because technically the courts had struck down that law, right? So you can't even call it civil disobedience. It was basically just them risking their lives to drive into the deep South to encounter this violence and then for the media to run rampant with it and to show it all over the country that no matter what the federal government says, there's still all kinds of evil going on in the South, right? And so, it's prevalent in Alabama because that's where they experience the most violence. That's where they experience the KKK. Go look up Anniston, Alabama. Go look up Birmingham, Alabama. Is it in reference to the Freedom Rides and to see the buses being bombed and the people being smoked out? I mean, if you knew every night that you laid your head down that there was somebody that was going to come in your house and bomb your house, there's no way and there's no way you would be able to rest peacefully, right? And so these people that were on these freedom rides that were on this had to constantly be aware. Like I mean, I can't imagine the stress that they were under not being protected and for the government, the state government in Alabama not to protect these riders is just proof that the state governments were hell bent on keeping the status quo, that segregation had a place in its culture. So when you're looking at the freedom rides and you're talking about that, like you're talking about the I mean, technically, did the freedom rides accomplish any major legislation? Well, no. It was already determined before they started it. Um, the Civil Rights Act of '64 would have ended those segregated facilities and accommodations, but that was 3 years after the event, right? I think the freedom rides just started like if you take the early '60s sit-ins, freedom rides, the violence that's being ensued, and even in the freedom summer, like the idea of violence being prevalent in the South and the media grabbing attention to educate the entire country was just as important as the actual protest itself. Yes, yes, God, yes. You can talk about the freedom rides in terms of state versus federal government because that's exactly what the conflict was. State and local laws were trying to keep Jim Crow prevalent. Ultimately, the federal law was that, the buses were public transportation among interstate travel was to be integrated. In reference to the Freedom Summer, go back and read that short path. It's only 2 pages. Even if you just glance over it, you're going to see a group that was the MSSC, the Mississippi State Sovereign Commission, that was funneling money to the Citizens Council, which was a political front pretty much for the KKK. The political voice in, like the main reason for the MSSC was to keep Jim Crow prevalent in society, to keep segregation the norm, and like a mass exodus of volunteers converged on Mississippi in the summer in these rural areas to help educate African Americans who were not registered to vote, help to teach and educate them about their political voice and using their political voice to help create change among the government and the culture in and around the South. So even in the Freedom Summer, it could have. Oh, and by the way, like all groups were in Mississippi at this time. The SNCC, SCLC, CORE, NAACP, like it was all hands on deck um, to help educate. Like I said, help educate African Americans about their political voice, and then to take kids at this time that maybe were receiving a less than superior education because of their underfunded African American schools, to use the summer to educate them and build their education. 3 civil rights workers, volunteers go missing in Mississippi at this time, and there's a huge cover-up of local politicians and police officers that the people are charged with a crime, but they don't serve like life sentences or anything. Um, Go back and read it. I know I'm looking at Caleb's question and I want to really answer that one, but I don't feel like I've truly. Oh, you got to look at the not the Missouri, sorry, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, um, because when you start reading that literature and you start seeing you know, the Democratic president at this time being LBJ, and understanding that he'd still need Democratic support from the South, but the Democrats were they were that corrupt segregationist type white person in Mississippi. You had a Freedom Democratic Party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, that would have been African Americans and whites. They were behind the civil rights movement. They were trying to disassociate themselves with the corruption among the Democratic Party. I think the Freedom Summer is just going to be another example of how civil rights groups were effective in helping create change. Now, the March on Washington, in my opinion, is very important because it's going to be. The march itself was organized to bring to light the discrimination practices as it related to jobs, right? People being discriminated, black, white, uh, African Americans not being able to get jobs because of their race, and so that was the kind of the main goal of the March on Washington. But it became this march of solidarity, of unity, um, of change and progress that the federal government could no longer ignore. I think like if you look at like one of the big positive results of the March on Washington is that it finally forced the federal government to align itself with the civil rights movement. Because even during the Freedom Ride sit-ins, Little Rock Nine, all these prior events to 63, the federal government wasn't necessarily all in on the civil rights movement. It was letting the states handle its business, or didn't want to upset the status quo, but it really forced the federal government to become to like I said, align itself with the movement. I mean, even after the March on Washington, you feel like you had this perfect ending with King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and everything's moving forward. And then a couple months later, what's really changed? We got a bomb going off in a church, on African American church in Birmingham, and 4 girls getting killed. And just 63 being a very sensible time with the assassination of the president. I mean, just a lot of chaos going on. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna get a drink of water. All right, next question. Ethan saying, kind of like you mentioned in Caleb's question, we talked about all these events, but we never really talked about an end. Okay. So when addressing a long-term impact, should we talk about the civil and voting right? I do think that you could conclude that during this time there were effective steps that were taken to address the discrimination issue, um, from those federal acts, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the 24th Amendment, I mean, if you did your reading, the Fair Housing Act, you could talk about the other Civil Rights Act of 57 and 60. I just, for the sake of conversation and not overloading you with information, I think talking about the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the 24th Amendment are the big key pieces of legislation that helped change the narrative and were extremely beneficial for this country 100 years removed from the Civil War. Um, I don't think the civil rights era is over. I still think in our country we're still struggling with racism and inequality and all kinds of issues that are hindering minorities in this country. I think it's obvious. And so when we're talking about a true end, I think it's one of those TOK questions or whatever you guys go over, like that just get you to think but and debate, but there's really not it's not like a math equation where you get a definite answer, right? And I think too, I don't want to give you so much information that I get 100 essays that say the same thing over and over. This is left open for you to interpret a little bit, analyze, evaluate. You just don't kill yourself. Dream. Go to bed. Dream. Sweet dreams. You're prepared. Been 51 minutes on this thing. I still got 8 people watching. Speak now, forever hold your peace. Trent, you want me to help you on Maston's homework? What do you got to do? Read a poem? Big whoop. See, here's my opinion with English, right? Like if me and you communicate, I get my point across, then I've completed English. It's a good thing that this is not being recorded or it can't come back to harm me, so that's good. What is a good bonus question? Ethan, I got a bonus question. I got a bonus question. Which historical figure was on my t-shirt? That might be a bonus question. Nugget. All right, 6 minutes. I'm cutting it off at 1 hour. That's true. I've always questioned Tareem's commitment to her education, Ethan. All right. No other questions. I'm gonna get off. You've got plenty of. You're prepared, guys. All right. This will be the last big essay exam of your junior year, so you can take up. You can take that to the bank. You know it. I have faith that you know it. I wasn't a part of Aguas's Motivational Monday. It's a shame. Here, I'll hit you with some inspiration. This will be the last thing that I say. and I'll try not to sound too cheesy, but I know it will because of who I am and what I'm doing. Your future will not be determined by this one test. And I know you probably get told that a lot. I think it's one of the biggest flaws of your class is that you are so worried and preoccupied with being perfect. And when it comes down to it, you're not. And I can't remember, I think it was Summerlin was saying that in her session with you guys last Wednesday. And I think it's a very, very big, important concept to understand. And so you can twist it any way you want to, Tareem. I'm not saying that grades don't matter because they do. But they matter in the realm of taking care of yourself and being the best Tareem you can be and not comparing yourself with anybody else. I have no problem in saying that my 23 ACT score is just as good as some of y'all's 36s, which I know that's obviously not the case. But the confidence that I have in that and being able to grow and learn and accept my failures to make me better individuals, to make me a better individual, I think is a concept and a quality that a lot of you individuals need to learn. I love you. I'm always going to love you. And it ain't going to change my opinion one way or another if you fail my test or if you make 100. Alright guys, I'm out. I do enjoy these. I'll be honest with you. Harrison texted me. What times did you text me, Harrison? 8:54. Harrison texted me and asked me if I was going live, and I was walking to the bedroom to go to bed, and I looked at my wife and I said, I'm just not going to have enough energy to do this. But yet, being able to hang out with you guys for an hour and talk history is awesome. So, good night, good luck, roll tide.